Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back to it. Welcome back to the entire shebang that we're getting after. We are now going to be getting back into Henry VIII, the defender of the faith, right? Yeah, right. Okay, keep telling yourself that. Now, anyway, so we ended up needing to kind of gloss over some stuff today in class just so we could get to the point where we could get this slide kind of out of our way and behind us. But we actually didn't talk about several things that were going on during this time period. But the big things we did go over is we talked about Henry VIII, right? We talked about his family. He's a tutor. We talked about his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon and stuff like that, right? And we talked about why he's going to establish the Church of England in 1530 because he wants to get a divorce from Catherine because he believed that the marriage was illegitimate. And I'll talk about that here in a second. And then and he has a child with her and it's Mary and they get banished to a nunnery and they end up going under house arrest and stuff like that. Mary's just sitting there seething and getting really, really mad. So Thomas More ends up dead because he's just like, don't marry Anne Boleyn. This is a bad idea. This is a bad idea. He goes public and then dead. And then also Henry annuls his marriage to Catherine and then he actually gets married to Anne and then doesn't produce male heir and it's just Elizabeth. And then he accuses her of cheating and stuff like that and incest and all this other crazy stuff and then dead. Now, anyway, look, going back to it though, at the very beginning of this whole thing, one little understanding thing that you have to understand is that a lot of this too was very political, right? A lot of the intricacies of Henry and why he wanted to get a divorce and why the Pope wouldn't grant it and things like that are very important to understand. So let's go all the way back to the beginning for a moment and just kind of talk about who Henry VIII is, the person, right? So technically Henry is the second Tudor king, right? Henry's father, Henry VII, was the first Tudor king. Now, I know we got a lot of really good questions last night about, or yesterday about, oh, well, when Henry's dad married into the Yorks who won the War of the Roses because one of their men married a Lancaster woman and brought an end to the War of the Roses then why did they eventually become the Tudors? Because the guy that was the very first York king after the War of the Roses, just a heads up, was Richard III. And Richard III was beaten in battle when one of the descendants of the House of York married a young man named Henry VII, who was Henry's father. And Henry said, oh, I am closer to being Henry VII. Henry's dad was, I am closer to being in a reign of the reign of king because the closest living relative to the last king was my wife, not this guy, right? And then Henry VII raised an army, fought against Richard III, won at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and actually ends up becoming the first Tudor king. And then he ends up dying and then giving the throne to his son Henry. Now, a really interesting thing, though, that also probably should be brought up is that Henry VIII would have never been able to do any of this stuff if it wasn't for his dad, right? Because his dad actually created a financial situation that was very stable in England, created a basic military alliance that kept Scotland away from them from being able to attack them at any point, and then also created a system where Henry had the ability to raise armies and funds if he wanted to go and do anything, right? One of the biggest things that Henry loved to do was invade France, all right? So because the French and the Henrys, French and Henry just don't like each other unless they're invading Charles V. Now, anyway, speaking of Charles V, though, who was the leader of the Holy Roman Empire during this time period, who is Aragon, Catherine of Aragon, in relation to him? It's his aunt, because where is Catherine from? She's from the Castile region of Spain, right? So, they are actually related, and the biggest reason why the Pope told him no, that he didn't want to allow him to get divorced, is due to the fact that relationship. Charles V did not want his aunt to be embarrassed and shunned away from English society because this marriage is being called illegitimate. Because interestingly enough, Catherine was married before. Catherine actually was married to Henry's older brother first, and then that brother died, and then basically Henry VII, Henry VIII's father was like, hey, Catherine, go marry the other son, go marry the other one. I know my other son just died, but go marry Henry VIII. And so she ends up doing it basically out of political pressure and being forced, and then so all of a sudden when Henry VIII's like, hey, I want to get a divorce, I want to get this marriage annulled because it's not legitimate because he was married to my brother first, and obviously God is punishing me because he won't give me a son, and he thinks that this marriage is invalid and gross as well. Well, Charles V had saved the Pope from several different battles and also these different wars in northern Italy, and so he told the Pope, do not allow this union to be dissolved. And so actually Charles V is kind of the first person that shows us that the monarchy is becoming much more powerful than the papacy during this time period. But anyway, he still gets the marriage annulled to Catherine, and then he ends up becoming Henry VIII, ruler of the Church of England, right? Now, anyway, going into it, though, Anne never produced that male heir, so she ends up dead. Good stuff. Now, anyway, in this process, though, after Anne has died, and he goes off and gets married to his third wife, Jane Seymour, apparently the only woman that he ever truly loved, is according to the entire story, she ends up producing a male heir. the guy that would be the heir to his throne, Edward VI, right? But unfortunately, Jane Seymour died during childbirth. Now, anyway, getting into it, though, so let's take a backtrack and kind of look at the pantheon now, right? So as of right now, we've got divorced Catherine of Aragon, and she has access to his only first, ruling daughter, Mary, right? And they are actually banished to, a convent. 2, you've got Elizabeth, right? And then her mom is dead because Anne Boleyn is, going to get accused of incest, and she dies. Also, fun fact, there was a big conspiracy theory, too, that Anne Boleyn was actually already pregnant with Elizabeth when Henry was still married to Catherine of Aragon because they were hooking up on the side. Now, anyway, then there's the third one, Jane Seymour, who was given birth to his son, Edward VI. Now, due to English tradition, Edward VI is inherently the one that will inherit the throne first due to the fact that he's the oldest male heir, right? Now, also important thing, though, in this entire process, while he was getting married to Jane Seymour and while Anne Boleyn was being put on trial, there was a very big thing that came down known as the Act of Supremacy. So do me a favor and write the Act of Supremacy. The Act of Supremacy was an act passed by Henry VIII that forced every single citizen within England to declare that he was the reigning head of church and that Anglicanism and the Anglican church would be the reigning and official church of the church of England in totality, right? So he basically created this system where he became the head of church and he's distancing himself from Catholics and from the Catholics that exist in England as well. Now, it's important to know, though, in the early part of the Act of Supremacy in the Anglican church and the Anglican faith, he did actually allow Catholics to still kind of exist, right? He allowed them to exist and he allowed them to have their monasteries and things like that. But we'll see here in a minute how things get kind of crazy as he starts kind of taking monastery lands away from a lot of people. Now, that was all going to happen under his advisor, Thomas Cromwell, who we'll get to here in a second. But then he goes on later to have 3 other wives, right? He has 3 other wives go Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, right? So now Anne of Cleves, one of my favorite stories, he actually ends up getting married to Anne of Cleves, but apparently never consummating the marriage, right? Due to the fact that his archbishop, Thomas Cromwell, who starts stripping land and money away from all of these monasteries in England, these Catholic monasteries, basically kind of pulling a 180 and being like, remember that time we were going to let y'all exist? Not! And they just start stealing all this land and this money. What ends up happening, though, is because he showed a portrait of Anne of Cleves to Henry VIII. And the portrait was painted by a guy named Hans Holbein. And we know Hans Holbein as the guy who actually painted the ambassadors. Isn't that right, Grace Williams, right? So Hans Holbein, portrait of Anne. Here she is. All right, so basically, apparently what ended up happening is Thomas Cromwell approached, Thomas Cromwell approached Henry VIII with this, painting. It was like, hey, check it out. This German princess that lives over in Cleves, isn't she good looking? You should totally marry her, and that'll actually give you some claims and some lands in, the Holy Roman Empire as well, in case you ever feel like going to war with Charles later on, which he does. But going into it, though, Anne of Cleves is going to be the one that ends up kind of being the funniest out of all the situations. Because when she arrives in England, he actually dresses like a servant to try and be like, oh, we're going to meet each other in a chivalrous fashion, and I'm going to, show up, and I'm going to dress as a servant, and one of the other servants will be dressed as a higher-ranking servant, but she's going to see me and will fall in love, and it'll be great. She got out of the cart, or out of the carriage, and then saw, Henry VIII, but then scoffed him off and started talking to somebody else, and he was very, very butthurt about it. Now, there were a lot of other rumors going along, too, about this entire thing about Anne of Cleves. There's this other big thing that Henry said that he didn't think she was attractive, and that he thought her breath smelled terrible, and that she looked goofy, and all this other stuff. So apparently they never consummated that marriage, so we can technically say that one ended in divorce, right? And because of this entire thing, Thomas Cromwell gets accused of treason against the king and the crown, and also for multiple other reasons he gets accused of this, and he ends up dead as well. So as you can see, Henry VIII really likes taking people's heads off their shoulders, right? So Catherine Howard, though, also comes into play a little bit later on, who then ends up cheating on him with another advisor, and then she ends up being executed because she actually has an affair with one of Henry VIII's courtiers, right? So, and the very, very last one who ends up being able to survive is Catherine Parr, right? And these 3 wives did not produce any children whatsoever. But Catherine Parr ends up living through the very, very terrible parts of Henry's life when he has gout and he becomes morbidly obese due to the fact that he can't really move at all because of his ulcery leg, and he's really, really gross. But what ends up going down, though, is that he still had a very active reign during when he was married to each of those individual women, right? So the Anglican Church, under the reign of Henry VIII, before his death, retained most of its Catholic rituals. So what you need to understand about the Anglican Church when Henry VIII started it, even though like we love talking about his wives and all that stuff, is that he retains most of those Catholic rituals, including confession, celibacy of priests, transubstantiation, and all these other things. Basically, Anglicanism under Henry was just diet Catholic, right? It was just Catholic with divorce. It was just like Catholicism with like a little bit of English spice, right? So, and he did it mainly just so he could actually create this political move, right? Henry later, though, however, decided with Thomas Cromwell, this guy right here we were just talking about, who ends up missing most of this part of his body, decided that he would do a 180 and dissolve English monasteries completely. And he was like, oh, wait a minute, these English monasteries are sitting on a huge amount of land and a huge amount of money. So they literally do an act called the dissolution of the monasteries, and they decide to actually strip land and strip monetary wealth and strip different things from these monasteries to create a system that he was considering having, which was known as the enclosure system. And we'll talk about the enclosure system a little bit later on, but do me a favor and put enclosure system underneath this whole thing when they started dissolving all of those monasteries. So what Henry VIII is basically doing right now is he's creating a situation in England where basically the Anglican Church is the only church that exists in England whatsoever. He did allow some Catholics to still practice, but it was never allowed in public and it had to be at home. And then like most of the Catholics that he actually allowed to practice were the ones that actually existed in Ireland, right? So he begins to strip these church lands for enclosures, and Cromwell, his chief minister, pushed most of these reforms, even though he ends up executing them in the long run. Now, what's going on, though, is you're seeing the assertion of the Anglican Church within England. So we're starting to create a movement or a modality where basically there's going to be a back and forth between Anglicans and Catholics. Due to Henry VIII's earliest rule, when he could have came out and created a foundation of saying the Anglican Church will be the founding church of the monarchy, as well as I will be the supreme head, and any of my descendants who follow me will be the supreme heads of the English Church as well, due to the Act of Supremacy. He could have just done that and then allowed people to still practice Catholicism, but what he decided to do instead was to create a system where Anglicanism is the only option you have for members of parliament, for high nobles, for anybody, and a lot of historians believe that this was a political move to prevent pressure coming from the Vatican and from Rome, right? And so since he ends up stripping all this wealth and this money, and since he ends up collecting all of these like goods, he then decides that he's tired of being the Lord of Ireland and he wants to be the King of Ireland, because Ireland still remained devoutly Catholic, and many of their rights and properties are going to be stripped and sold by the English, right? Because basically in the long run, the Irish during this time period, and he's going to take it over in 1547 completely, right? The Irish, he actually owned a heavy amount of wealth, land, and titles in Ireland, right? But Henry VIII, at the earliest part of his reign, he was known as the Lord of Ireland. But he directly invades Ireland and becomes what is known as the King of Ireland, and Ireland gets usurped into the English territory and into the English crown in 1547 completely. Now, later on, he had the hopes or the wants of actually finding a way to bring in Scotland as well to unify all the crowns together, but unfortunately he's going to die before that entire process happens, right? So what a lot of the Irish people do is, even though he tries to push the Anglican Church within the realms and bounds of Ireland, it doesn't actually necessarily work, because most of the Catholics in Ireland just become like at-home Catholics. Like they created small like areas of worship, and they created like little what do they call it? Little things, like little like vestibules, I guess, like little things where they could actually do offerings and still pray to Christ in a Catholic manner. And they also apparently smuggled Irish priests all over the country. A lot of Irish Catholic homes from this time period had these things in them called priest holes, which is this little hole down in the, like, it's basically a cellar where they could hide priests, Catholic priests in them, who would then actually be like kind of smuggled from house to house to practice masses and things like that. So the Irish did not stop being Catholic just because Henry VIII invaded and took over and tried to strip all their land and wealth from them, right? So small rebellions are going to pop up during this time period, but the shift is going to rise up, but they're mostly going to be suppressed. Like, for example, there was this one massive rebellion that was supposed to be a non-violent one known as the Pilgrimage of Grace that Henry just came in and violently suppressed, right? So basically what we're seeing right now is the creation of a situation where the crown is willing to use violence to suppress the growth of anything non-church related in a lot of sense, right? So Edward VI, though, when he comes to power, is only going to rule for about 6-ish years, right? When Edward VI comes to power, he's 9 years old, right? He's 9. He's 9. Look at him. He's so gross looking. So obviously we can also tell that Edward is very genetically weak, right? And he's following the reign of his father that has stripped monastery lands, passed the Act of Supremacy, created a system where he invaded Ireland, took all of the, it's basically made Catholicism illegal in the higher echelons of English society. And he's 9 years old when he comes to power, and he's got to figure out a way to stabilize all these things, right? Now, 9-year-old Edward only ruled until he was 15, though, right? And he died very, very early on, okay? He's really only ruled for 2 years if you count the fact that he didn't really do anything from 9 to 11 or 12 because he really couldn't. And then also he was sick most of the time, right? He was a very, very, very sickly child. And also he almost got married to a 7-month-old. Now, anyway, I know that sounds a little weird, but check this out. So what ended up happening is while Edward was a child, while he was really, really young, he was actually 4 years old, Henry tried to have his 4-year-old son married off to Mary, Queen of Scots, right? A very, very important name that you're going to need to keep in the back of your head. Mary, Queen of Scots, right? So he tries to get him married off to Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the soon-to-be Queen of Scotland, right? And he wanted to figure out a way, Henry did while Edward was young, to make it so Scotland stopped being an ally of France and instead was an ally of his, and he wanted to unify the crowns by having his son married off to Mary, Queen of Scots, so when both representative parents died, he would become King of Scotland as well. Pretty smart idea, but it didn't work out because the marriage never ever went through, right? And so he also tried to give the throne to somebody that wasn't his sister. He tried to give the throne to his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who is actually a very important story that we'll talk about in class tomorrow, right? He also created, though, this other thing called the Book of Common Prayer, which became the guiding text for Anglican churches, how their mass is supposed to be practiced, what it was going to be different about it from the Catholic Church, etc., etc., etc. And the Book of Common Prayer becomes a very, very important thing going on later. However, though, big thing ends up getting passed by Parliament in 1543, known as the Third Secession Act, right? So the plan was that Edward was going to try to give the throne to his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, for several different reasons. One, he wasn't married, so he couldn't give it to any of his descendants or his wife or anybody else. He wanted to figure out a way to try and give the throne in a successionary line to somebody that wasn't Catholic. Because according to the Third Secession Act, they wanted to keep the Tudors in power. Because due to the fact that they wanted to avoid another massive civil war from breaking out, like the War of the Roses that had come before that established the Tudor line in the first place, right? So they had passed the Third Secession Act in 1543, which legally would give the throne to the female descendants of the Tudor dynasty, right? But everybody was kind of banking on the fact that Mary might be dead by that point, or maybe they'll go away to France, or maybe she'll disinherit themselves completely. But what ended up happening is Mary comes to power when Edward dies at the age of 15, and she becomes the first Queen of England. And when she comes in, even though her dad called her a bastard, the reign of Mary I is short but very intense. So much so that they refer to her as Bloody Mary, right? So she wasn't bloody just immediately yet, but she becomes very bloody early on when she tries to deliberately return England to Catholicism, right? She pulls England back to Catholicism. She tries to do away with the Anglican Church completely, and she only ruled for about 5 years, right? Now, in this process, she got married to Charles V's son, Philip II of Spain, which is a very, very big deal. So Philip II inherently became the King of England, not in right, but only in title, okay? You have to understand something about the British Parliament, right? The British Parliament, which was an established and very long-standing governmental body and acts as the legislative branch of the entire English government, they are not about to let Philip II of Spain, the Habsburg, control England as well, on top of the Holy Roman Empire and Spain and Austria, right? So they actually created a system where basically the queens of England now had more power, and they actually used that Third Secession Act of 1543 to do that. So they she tries to pull England back to Catholicism. She marries the most Catholic king that exists in Philip II, even though it was kind of a little bit of a weird marriage because Mary was 37 and Philip was 27, and so the difference in age was very, very, very wide, which was really, really gross and weird. And apparently Philip always said, he was I don't really find her attractive at all. And then she was but I love him and I think he's beautiful, right? So she also, though, funny enough, was not the best at being Bloody Mary, right? Also, Philip and her never conceived a child, right? Some rumors happen too that he was actually away in Spain for most of the time, that they only ever slept in the same bed once. There's a lot of different rumors that happen about them, but we do know one big thing though is after they got married, Mary believed she was pregnant, and she actually even had what was known as a phantom pregnancy, right? So Mary's stomach swelled, and she actually her cycle stopped and stuff like that, and she actually thought she was pregnant. But doctors came to realize later that she actually wasn't pregnant at all, that her mind had convinced her that she was pregnant because she wanted to be pregnant so bad and elongate the reign of the Catholic Church within England, right? Give me 1 second. Okay, you can come in, but I'm going to keep flipping. Yes. Do you want to go see your face now?
Is it recording?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. You should have a bloopers reel at the end.
Bloopers reel?
Yeah.
I'll just put this in there. You want to say hi to everybody?
Hey guys.
Do you want to dab? You have a notebook in your hand. All right, anyway, so go sit over there real quick. I'm almost done, okay? Now, anyway, so Bloody Mary was really, really bad at being Bloody Mary. The nickname actually wasn't even that good because she only killed, a few hundred Protestants. Now, anyway, so, if you're going to be called Bloody Mary, you better kill at least 1,000 people.
Yeah,
but she only killed, a few hundred people.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, whoa. We don't know that for sure. We do not know for sure if Caesar killed, several, million people or anything like that.
She might have killed more than,
Yeah, exactly, right? She might have killed more than him. But anyway, she becomes Bloody Mary, and apparently if you go into a bathroom and say her name 3 times in a mirror and spin around and light a candle, apparently she'll jump out at you or something like that. Now, anyway, but the big thing about it, though, is that 1,000 or so Protestants fled. Now, you see that number right there, 1,000? Those 1,000 are going to become a very, very important group later on, so definitely highlight them, underline them. They do become important because these fleeing Protestants end up coming back, and later on when they come back known as the Puritans. Now, anyway, big thing, though, also, look how goofy Mary looks. All right, so Mary was really old. She was just whenever she came into power, and she died because she was already 30-something. And apparently 30-something in the 1540s looks a heck of a lot older than 30-something now. Am I right? Now, anyway, so really, really quick, though, this, of course, being her husband, Philip II, she ended up, did you know that? Her husband was the son of Charles V. Good talk. Now, anyway, so really, really quick, though. Big thing that ends up going down, she ends up dying randomly one night in her bed, and then she would be followed up by the reign of her sister, Elizabeth I, the Iron Queen, the absolute boss. Wait, what's it called? Something boss girl, boss. Katie, tweet, whatever you say. Huh? Yeah, something like that. It's something boss lady. Elizabeth I is that boss lady, all right? So we'll talk about that soon. We'll get to that tomorrow. I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one. Look at that little short flip that y'all have. It's only 22 minutes.